The candles had barely been lit when Alaric Vane realized something was wrong with the seating at his own table. He had returned from the war only 4 days earlier, still unused to the weight of the title that now sat on his shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. He was the Duke of Rookwood now, and the house that had once felt like a place of freedom now felt like a stage where every move he made was watched, measured, and whispered about later in the halls. He walked into the dining room expecting the usual arrangement his aunt, Lady Constance, always prepared for these evenings. A parade of eligible young women, each one polished and presented like a prize at a country fair, each one hoping to catch the eye of the new Duke before the season ended. He had endured 3 of these dinners already since his return, and he had learned to brace himself before the doors opened. But this time, the woman seated beside his chair was not one he recognized. She was slight, with dark hair pulled back simply, wearing a gown far less extravagant than the others in the room. She did not look up when he approached. She did not flutter her fan or offer the practiced smile the other women wore like armor. She simply sat, spine straight, hands folded, staring at the empty plate in front of her, as though she would rather be anywhere else on earth. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I don't believe we have been introduced." She looked up then, and her eyes were sharp, almost startled, as though she hadn't expected him to speak to her directly. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like she was bracing for something. "I was told this was my seat." "Told by whom?" "Your aunt." Alaric glanced down the table, where Lady Constance sat at the far end, deep in conversation with an elderly baron, not once looking in his direction. He knew that posture. He had seen it his whole life. It was the posture of a woman who was very much paying attention while pretending not to. He took his seat. There was nothing to be done about it now, not without causing a scene in front of 20 guests, so he simply nodded to Miss Whitmore and reached for his napkin. "I understand you are new to the county," he said, more out of duty than curiosity. "I am not new at all," she replied. "I have lived 3 miles from this house my entire life. You simply never noticed me before." There was something in the way she said it, not bitter exactly, but tired, like she had rehearsed the sentence many times in her head and finally found the nerve to say it aloud. Alaric studied her for a moment. "Then I apologize for the oversight." "You needn't apologize. I didn't ask to be seated here." "Then who did?" She hesitated, glancing once more toward the end of the table, toward Lady Constance, who still had not looked up. "I couldn't say," Eleanor said carefully. "I was simply told where to sit, the same as everyone else." The dinner continued around them, the clatter of silver against porcelain, the low hum of a dozen conversations, laughter rising and falling like waves. But between Alaric and Eleanor, there was only a strange, watchful silence, the kind that exists between 2 people, who both suspect they have been placed somewhere on purpose, but cannot yet say by whom or why. He tried, out of politeness, to make conversation. He asked about her family. She answered plainly, without embellishment, that her father had died when she was young, and her mother had passed only 2 winters ago, leaving her in the care of a distant aunt who did not have much patience for a woman who preferred books to suitors. "And do you?" Alaric asked. "Prefer books to suitors?" "I prefer honesty to flattery," she said. "Suitors rarely offer the former." He found himself, despite his exhaustion, almost smiling. It had been a long time since anyone at his table had said something that wasn't designed to please him. Across the room, a young woman named Charlotte Halden, dressed in pale blue silk with pearls at her throat, kept glancing toward the head of the table where Alaric sat, clearly annoyed that she had been placed 3 seats away, instead of beside him as she had expected. Her brother, Lord Halden, noticed her irritation and leaned over to whisper something that made her sit up straighter, her polite smile returning like a mask, clicking back into place. Alaric noticed the exchange but said nothing. He had learned, in his short time as Duke, that every dinner was a small battlefield, and every guest was fighting a war of their own, whether he understood the terms of it or not. When the meal ended and the guests began to drift toward the drawing room for cards and quiet conversation, Alaric found a moment to approach his aunt. "Aunt Constance," he said, keeping his voice low, "might I ask why Miss Whitmore was seated beside me tonight?" Lady Constance did not even turn to face him fully. She was arranging a small vase of flowers on a side table, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "Was she not suitable company?" "That is not what I asked." The housekeeper arranges the seating cards, Alaric. I simply approve the final list. If there was an error, I shall speak to her about it. There is no need to trouble her. I only wish to understand. There is nothing to understand, Lady Constance said, finally turning to look at him, her expression perfectly pleasant, perfectly unreadable. It was likely a simple mistake. These things happen at large dinners. Alaric watched her for a long moment. He had known his aunt his entire life, and if there was one thing he knew about her without doubt, it was that she never made mistakes. Not with seating charts, not with introductions, not with anything that mattered to the running of her household. She had managed this estate with the precision of a general for over a decade, first for his father, and now for him. Of course, he said finally, though he did not believe her for a moment. A simple mistake. He left her among her flowers and walked toward the drawing room, but his mind kept circling back to the woman with the sharp eyes and the plain gown, the one who had said she preferred honesty to flattery, the one who had looked at him not as a duke to be won, but as a man to be assessed. He did not know it yet, but that dinner was only the beginning. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Alaric sat alone in his study, turning the evening over in his mind. He thought of his aunt's calm denial, the way she had smoothed her flowers instead of meeting his eyes properly. He thought of Eleanor Whitmore's plain gown against the silk and pearls of the other women, and how she had not seemed to care one bit about the difference. He told himself it meant nothing. A seating error, nothing more. His aunt was a busy woman managing a large household, and mistakes, however rare for her, were not impossible. But some small, stubborn part of him did not believe it, and that part of him was already looking forward, with an unease he could not quite name, to the next dinner. The following week arrived faster than Alaric expected, carried in on a flurry of correspondence and callers, all of them polite, all of them circling the same subject with the patience of hunters, who knew their prey could not run forever. He was, after all, the most eligible bachelor in the county now, and every family with an unmarried daughter seemed determined to remind him of it. He spent his mornings reviewing the estate ledgers with his steward, a quiet, careful man named Harold Pratt, who had served the Rookwood family since before Alaric was born. It was during one of these sessions, as they worked through a stack of invoices from the local merchants, that Alaric found himself asking, almost carelessly, whether Harold knew anything about the seating arrangements for the household's dinners. Harold's pen paused over the ledger for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The seating cards, Your Grace. Yes. Who prepares them? The housekeeper draws up the initial arrangement, based on rank and precedent, as is proper. Lady Constance reviews the final list before each dinner. And does she often make changes to it? Harold's expression remained carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that Alaric was beginning to recognize as deliberate. I could not say, Your Grace. I am not privy to Lady Constance's private decisions. But you know something. I know only that Lady Constance takes her duties as hostess very seriously, and that nothing in this house happens without her knowledge. It was not an answer, not really, but it told Alaric everything he needed to know. His aunt was involved in the seating, more deeply than she had admitted, and Harold was too loyal, or too frightened, to say more than that. Alaric let the matter rest for the time being, though it settled in the back of his mind like a splinter he could not quite remove. 3 days later, another dinner was held, this one smaller, more intimate, meant to welcome a visiting cousin from the north. Alaric walked into the dining room, already half expecting what he found, and yet the sight of it still caught him off guard. Eleanor Whitmore, seated once more at his right hand. She looked up at him this time with something closer to resignation than surprise, as though she too had begun to suspect this was not accidental. It seems, she said quietly as he took his seat, that fate has a strange sense of humor. Or my aunt does, Alaric replied. Eleanor's lips twitched, almost a smile, quickly suppressed. I would not presume to accuse Lady Constance of anything. I would, Alaric said, though I have no proof. Perhaps there is nothing to prove. Perhaps I am simply an unlucky woman who keeps drawing the wrong card. You do not sound unlucky. You sound like someone who has already worked out the truth and is deciding whether to share it with me. Eleanor set down her fork and studied him for a long moment, as though weighing something in her mind. Your aunt knew my mother, she said finally, many years ago, before either of us were born. They were close, once, The way young women sometimes are, before life pulls them in different directions. Alaric leaned forward slightly. This was new information, something no one else had mentioned. Close how? I do not know the whole story. My mother rarely spoke of it, except to say that there had been a falling out between the families, something to do with a broken promise, though she never told me the details. She died before I could ask her properly. Eleanor's voice remained even, but there was a flicker of old grief beneath it. I only mention it because it seems too great a coincidence that your aunt, who barely acknowledged my existence a month ago, has suddenly decided I belong beside you at every dinner she hosts. Alaric sat back, turning the pieces over in his mind. A broken promise, an old friendship, his aunt's silence and his aunt's flowers, arranged just so, her eyes carefully avoiding his, the moment he asked a direct question. Do you think, he asked slowly, that she is trying to correct something from the past? I think, Eleanor said, that older women, who have lost the chance to fix their own mistakes, often try to fix them through someone else instead. It was a sharp observation, and an uncomfortable one, and Alaric found he could not argue with it. The rest of the dinner passed with less tension than the first, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm of conversation that surprised them both. Eleanor spoke of the small cottage she shared with her aunt, of the garden she tended herself because her aunt found the exercise beneath her, of the books she borrowed from the county library and read late into the night by candlelight because sleep rarely came easily to her. Alaric spoke, more than he meant to, of the war, of the men he had commanded, and the ones he had not been able to bring home, of the strange hollow feeling of returning to a house full of servants who called him Your Grace when all he wanted, some days, was to be called by his first name again. You do not sound like a man who wanted this title, Eleanor observed. I did not, Alaric admitted. My cousin was meant to inherit it. He did not survive the war either. Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly. I am sorry. You need not be. It was not your doing. No, she agreed, but sorrow does not require blame to be sincere. It was, Alaric thought, one of the truest things anyone had said to him since he came home. By the time the guests began to depart, Alaric found himself reluctant to see Eleanor go. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He was a man who had spent years learning to keep his feelings locked away, where no one, especially not the enemy, could use them against him. He did not like the feeling of a lock coming loose without his permission. He found his aunt again that evening, this time in her private sitting room, where she sat with a book she was not truly reading, her eyes lifting the moment he entered, as though she had been expecting him. You seated Miss Whitmore beside me again, he said, without preamble. Did I? Lady Constance closed her book, unbothered. How careless of me. Aunt Constance, please. I am not a child, and I am not a fool. I know when I am being managed. Managed, she repeated, as though tasting the word. Is that what you believe I am doing? I believe you knew her mother. I believe there was some falling out between your families, and I believe you have decided, for reasons of your own, to correct it through me. For the first time since his return, Alaric watched something shift in his aunt's expression, a crack in the calm composure she wore like armor. It was there only for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by the same pleasant, unreadable mask she always wore. You are very perceptive, Alaric, she said finally. Your father was the same way. It used to drive me mad. Then you admit it. I admit nothing, she said, standing and smoothing her skirts. I admit only that Miss Whitmore is a fine young woman, from a good family, whatever troubles occurred between us in the past, and that a man in your position could do far worse than to spend an evening in her company. That is not the same as admitting you arranged it. No, Lady Constance agreed, moving toward the door. It is not. Good night, Alaric. She left him standing alone in the sitting room, no closer to the full truth than he had been before, but with one thing made clear at last. His aunt was not going to deny it outright, and she was not going to stop. Whatever game she was playing, whatever old promise she was trying to mend through him and a woman he barely knew, it was far from over. Alaric returned to his own chambers that night, but sleep did not come easily. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking not of the war, not of the estate, not of the ledgers waiting for him in the morning, but of a woman with sharp eyes and a plain gown, who preferred honesty to flattery, and who had looked at him, twice now, as though she saw something in him that no one else had bothered to look for. He did not know yet what his aunt intended, or how far she was willing to go to see it through, but he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had, that the next dinner would not be the last time Eleanor Whitmore was seated beside him. And some quiet, stubborn part of him, a part he was not yet ready to examine too closely, found that he did not mind the thought at all. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that Alaric could no longer pretend was accidental. Every dinner his aunt hosted, whether grand or small, whether for visiting nobility or the local gentry, ended with Eleanor Whitmore seated at his right hand. The other guests began to notice too, though most were too polite, or too wary of Lady Constance, to say anything aloud. Charlotte Halden was not so restrained. "It does seem odd," she said one evening, cornering Alaric near the fireplace while the other guests drifted toward the card tables, "that Miss Whitmore is always placed beside you. One might almost think your aunt has decided the matter already, without consulting you at all." "My aunt manages the household," Alaric said carefully. "She does not manage me." Charlotte's smile was thin and knowing. "Of course not, Your Grace. I only mention it because I would hate for you to feel obligated toward a woman, simply because your aunt has decided it is convenient. Some matches are made from affection, others are made from old debts that have nothing to do with the two people expected to pay them." It was a sharp remark, sharper than Alaric expected from a woman who had, until now, seemed content to smile and say little of substance. He filed it away, along with everything else he did not yet understand about the tangled history his aunt seemed determined to keep buried. Later that same evening, he found Eleanor near the garden doors, looking out at the darkened grounds rather than joining the card games inside. She had a way of removing herself from a crowded room without ever seeming rude about it, simply stepping to its edges until she became part of the furniture, watching everything and saying little. "Miss Halden seems very interested in our seating arrangement," Alaric said, coming to stand beside her. "Miss Halden is interested in becoming Duchess of Rookwood," Eleanor replied, without looking at him. "I imagine she would be interested in anything that stood between her and that goal. You do not seem troubled by her opinion." "I have had a lifetime of practice not being troubled by opinions that were never meant kindly to begin with." She finally turned to look at him. "Does it trouble you, being watched so closely by everyone in that room?" "I have been watched closely since the day I was born," Alaric said. "I stopped noticing it somewhere around the time I learned to walk." Eleanor's mouth curved, the closest thing to a genuine smile he had seen from her yet. That must be a lonely way to grow up. It was, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "I did not expect to say that aloud." Sometimes the truth slips out when we least expect it to. I find it happens most often with people we have decided, without quite meaning to, that we can trust. The words hung between them in the cool evening air, neither of them quite ready to examine what they meant. Alaric found himself studying her profile in the dim light from the drawing-room windows, the sharp line of her jaw, the steady calm in her eyes even now, even here, surrounded by people who would happily see her fail, simply for being where she was not expected to be. "May I ask you something honestly?" he said finally. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer honestly, but I shall try. Do you want to be here, at these dinners, beside me? Or is this simply another obligation you have been handed, the same as I have?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, longer than Alaric expected, as though she were turning it over from every angle, before trusting herself to answer. "I did not want to be here," she said finally. "Not at first. I felt like a piece being moved across a board by hands I could not see, for reasons no one bothered to explain to me. I resented it. I still do, in part." She paused. "But I find, more and more, that I do not resent your company. That is a separate matter entirely, and one I am still deciding what to do with." It was not a declaration of anything. It was, if anything, a warning, a careful admission that stopped short of promising more than she was ready to give. But Alaric found it settled something in his chest that had been restless since the first dinner, since the moment he had looked down and found a stranger seated where a stranger should not have been. "Then we are agreed on one thing," he said. "Neither of us asked for this. And yet here we are." "Here we are," Eleanor echoed, and for the first time, there was no bitterness in it at all. Over the following days, Alaric found himself seeking her out, even outside the formal dinners his aunt arranged. He rode past her cottage more often than the estate business strictly required, and twice found reasons to call at her aunt's small parlor, under the pretense of neighborly duty, though both of them understood, without saying so, that duty had very little to do with it. Her aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Margaret Cole, watched these visits with open suspicion, clearly unconvinced that a duke's sudden interest in her niece could possibly end well for a family with so little standing to protect itself. But Eleanor bore her aunt's disapproval with the same steady patience she seemed to bear everything else, neither arguing nor apologizing for choices she had not yet fully made. It was during one of these visits, seated in the small, sun-warmed parlor, with tea growing cold between them, that Alaric finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had followed him since that very first dinner. "Your mother and my aunt," he said carefully. "You mentioned once that there had been a falling out between them. Do you know more of it than you told me?" Eleanor set down her teacup, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded, which Alaric had come to understand was progress in itself. "Only fragments," she said. "My mother mentioned it perhaps twice in my whole life, and never willingly. Once, when she was very ill, she said something about a promise that was broken, and how she had never forgiven herself for letting it happen, though she would not explain what the promise concerned." "Do you think it concerned your family and mine?" "I think it must have," Eleanor said. "Why else would your aunt, after so many years of silence, suddenly insist on seating me beside her nephew at every dinner she hosts? It is not the behavior of a woman with nothing to atone for." Alaric turned the thought over slowly. An old promise, broken between two families who had once, it seemed, been close enough for that promise to matter. His aunt, guarding the truth of it, as fiercely as she guarded every other secret in that great house. And somewhere in the middle of it, two people who had never asked to be tangled together, finding that they did not particularly mind the tangle after all. "I intend to find out the truth of it," he said, "whatever it costs me to ask." "Be careful," Eleanor warned, though there was warmth beneath the caution. "Your aunt has kept this secret a very long time. Women like her do not surrender their secrets easily, even to the people they love most. Then I shall simply have to be more stubborn than she is." Eleanor's laugh, quiet and surprised, was the first he had heard from her, and he found he wanted very badly to hear it again. Lord Halden arrived at Rookwood Hall on a bright afternoon in early autumn, his carriage far grander than the occasion required, his manner polished to a shine that made Alaric instinctively wary. He was a wealthy man, well-connected, the kind of suitor Lady Constance would once have welcomed with open arms for her nephew's matrimonial prospects, and Alaric understood immediately why his aunt had invited him to stay for a week of hunting and entertainment. What he had not expected was the way Lord Halden's attention settled, almost immediately, on Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore," he said at their first meeting, bowing with practiced grace, "I confess I did not expect to find such interesting company in the countryside. My sister mentioned you, though she did not do you justice." Eleanor accepted the compliment with polite reserve, the same reserve she offered everyone she did not yet trust, but Alaric noticed the way Lord Halden's eyes lingered on her throughout the following days, the way he seemed to appear wherever she happened to be, offering his arm, his conversation, his considerable charm. It should not have bothered Alaric. He had no claim on Eleanor, no formal understanding between them, beyond a growing friendship neither of them had properly named, and yet he found himself watching Lord Halden with a sharpness that surprised him. A hot, unfamiliar flash of something he did not want to call jealousy, but could not honestly call anything else. "You seem troubled," Harold Pratt observed one afternoon, as they worked through the estate accounts together. "If I may say so, Your Grace, you have read that same line 4 times without turning the page." Alaric set down his pen, frustrated with himself. "Lord Halden seems very taken with Miss Whitmore." "So I have noticed. You disapprove?" Harold considered his words carefully, as he always did. "It is not my place to approve or disapprove of anything, Your Grace. But I will say that Lord Halden is known, in certain circles, for pursuing interests he has no true intention of keeping. He is a collector of admiration, not a man who commits himself easily." It was more than Harold usually offered on such matters, and Alaric took it seriously. He found Eleanor that evening in the library, a room she had claimed as her own refuge whenever the house grew too crowded with guests she had little patience for. "Lord Halden seems quite taken with you," he said. trying to keep his tone light and failing rather badly. Eleanor glanced up from her book, one eyebrow raised. "Does that trouble you, Your Grace?" "Should it?" "I could not say. You are the one frowning, as though someone has insulted your horse." Despite himself, Alaric laughed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Forgive me. I have no right to question your company." "No," Eleanor agreed, "you do not, but I will tell you plainly, since you seem determined to worry yourself over nothing, that Lord Haldan's charm does not particularly move me. He speaks a great deal about himself, and very little about anything of substance. I find myself far more interested in men who ask questions, rather than simply answering the ones they wish had been asked. Is that meant to be a compliment?" "Take it however you like," Eleanor said, returning to her book, though the corner of her mouth betrayed the smallest hint of a smile. The relief that flooded through Alaric at those words was disproportionate, he knew, to anything that had actually been said. But he could not deny it, could not pretend any longer that his interest in Eleanor Whitmore was simple curiosity or idle friendship. Somewhere between the first dinner and this quiet evening in the library, something had changed, and he was no longer certain he wanted to change it back. Lord Haldan, however, was not so easily deterred. Over the following days he continued his pursuit with a persistence that bordered on rudeness, cornering Eleanor at every opportunity, offering gifts she politely declined, praising her wit in front of guests, until even Charlotte Haldan grew visibly uncomfortable with her brother's behavior. Matters came to a head one evening during a walk through the gardens, when Alaric came upon Lord Haldan pressing Eleanor, rather more insistently than propriety allowed, his hand closing over hers despite her clear attempt to withdraw it. "Lord Haldan," Alaric said, his voice carrying an authority he had not needed to use since his days commanding soldiers, "I believe Miss Whitmore has made her wishes clear." Lord Haldan released her hand immediately, though his smile remained smooth and unbothered. "Merely a misunderstanding, Your Grace. Miss Whitmore and I were simply discussing the merits of the evening air. Then perhaps you might discuss them from a greater distance," Alaric said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lord Haldan bowed, still smiling, though something colder flickered behind his eyes, before he excused himself and walked back toward the house, leaving Alaric and Eleanor alone beneath the darkening sky. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, once he was out of earshot. "You need not thank me. Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps, but not every man notices when a woman needs rescuing before she has to ask for it." They stood together in the quiet garden, close enough now that Alaric could see the faint flush still lingering on her cheeks from her encounter with Lord Haldan, close enough to notice the way her breathing had steadied only now that the other man had gone. "Eleanor," he said, her name unfamiliar and yet entirely natural on his tongue, the first time he had used it without her formal title attached. "I must tell you something, and I find I am rather more nervous saying it than I was facing cannon fire." Her eyes lifted to his, wary and curious all at once. "Then perhaps you had better say it quickly, before your courage fails you entirely. I do not believe, any longer, that my aunt's seating arrangements are the only reason I wish to be near you at every dinner she hosts. I believe I would seek you out regardless, whether she arranged it or not. I believe I have wanted to, for some time now, and have simply been too much of a coward to admit it plainly." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alaric feared he had misjudged everything entirely, that he had mistaken friendship for something deeper and embarrassed them both in the process. But then Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that he could see the careful, guarded hope in her expression, the same hope he suspected mirrored his own. "I have wondered," she said softly, "whether you would ever say so aloud, or whether I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I had imagined the whole thing." It was not quite a declaration, not from either of them, but it was enough, for that quiet evening in the garden, to know that whatever game Lady Constance had begun with her carefully arranged seating cards, it had grown into something neither of them intended to walk away from easily. The confrontation Alaric had been avoiding for weeks finally arrived on a gray afternoon, when rain kept most of the household confined indoors, and tempers grew short from too much time spent in close quarters. He found his aunt in the study that had once belonged to his father, going through correspondence with her usual brisk efficiency, and he closed the door behind him, with more force than he intended. "I want the truth," he said, without preamble. "All of it. No more careful evasions, no more talk of housekeeping mistakes. I know you have been placing Eleanor beside me deliberately, every single dinner, since the day I returned home. I want to know why." Lady Constance set down her letters slowly, studying her nephew with an expression that held, for once, no trace of amusement. "Sit down, Alaric." "I would rather stand." "Sit down," she repeated, "because this is not a conversation I intend to have while you loom over me like an interrogator." He sat, though every muscle in his body remained tense, ready for whatever explanation she was finally prepared to offer. "Eleanor's mother," Lady Constance began, "was named Sophia, and she was my dearest friend in this world, long before your mother ever came into it. We were girls together, inseparable, the kind of friendship that feels as though it will last forever, right up until the moment it does not. What happened between you?" "Your grandfather," Lady Constance said, her voice tightening slightly, "did not approve of Sophia's family. They had money once, but lost it through poor investments, and by the time Sophia and I were of an age to marry, her family's fortunes had fallen considerably below what he considered acceptable for anyone connected to this house. I had promised Sophia, foolishly, that I would always stand by her, regardless of what anyone else believed about her worth. And when the moment came to prove it, when your grandfather forbade our continued friendship and threatened to cut off my allowance entirely if I persisted in associating with a family he considered beneath us, I chose my comfort over my promise." The admission hung heavy in the room, the rain drumming steadily against the windows. "I broke a promise I made to the one person who had ever truly known me," Lady Constance continued, "and I told myself, for years, that it did not matter, that Sophia would understand, that circumstances were simply circumstances and could not be helped. I did not speak to her again for nearly 20 years. By the time I finally worked up the courage to write to her, to try to mend what I had broken, she was already gravely ill. She died before my letter reached her." "And Eleanor?" "Eleanor grew up knowing only that her mother had once had a dear friend who abandoned her when it mattered most. I do not know precisely what Sophia told her, if anything at all, but I have carried the weight of that broken promise every single day since her death. And when you returned home, and I saw Eleanor again, properly, for the first time in years, I saw an opportunity I could not let pass. An opportunity to fix what you broke. An opportunity," Lady Constance said, "to give her family what I denied her mother. A place, a welcome, a chance to be seen as worthy, in this house, of a duke's attention, rather than dismissed as beneath it. I will admit, freely, that I hoped something more might grow from it, because I have watched you since your return, Alaric, and I have seen how lonely you have become, how carefully you guard yourself against feeling anything at all. I thought, perhaps selfishly, that Eleanor might be the one person capable of reaching past that guard, and I did not trust either of you to find your way to each other without a little interference." Alaric sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything his aunt had finally confessed. He understood now the guilt that had driven her, the old grief dressed up as matchmaking, the broken promise she had spent years trying, quietly and clumsily, to repair through the only means still available to her. "You should have simply told me," he said finally, "rather than manipulating us both into a situation neither of us understood." "Perhaps," Lady Constance admitted, "but I have found, in my long life, that people rarely choose the harder, better path when the easier one is offered to them instead. I did not trust you to seek her out on your own, not when duty and grief had made you so guarded. I am sorry for the manner of it, Alaric, even if I am not sorry for the outcome. There may be no outcome at all, if Eleanor discovers she has been used as a pawn in your penance." Something flickered across his aunt's face then. Real worry. The first genuine crack in her composure since the conversation began. "Does she not care for you?" "I believe she does," Alaric said carefully. "But I do not know how she will feel, learning that her place beside me at every dinner was never truly her own choice, or even mine, but yours, arranged out of guilt for a debt you owed her mother, rather than any true regard for her as she is." Lady Constance's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of decades finally showing on her face. "Then I have made a terrible mistake." "Perhaps," Alaric said, standing at last. "Or perhaps, there is still time to make it right. Honestly this time, rather than through seating cards and careful silences." He left the study without waiting for her response, his mind already turning toward the more difficult task ahead, finding Eleanor, and deciding how much of the truth she deserved to hear from him. before someone else told her a version of it that stripped away every good intention his aunt had buried inside her guilt. Word travels quickly in a house full of servants, and Alaric had not accounted for how quickly, nor for how easily overheard conversations could twist into something crueler by the time they reached their intended target. He learned, too late, that a maid passing near the study door had caught fragments of his conversation with Lady Constance and repeated them to another servant, who repeated them to Margaret Cole's own housekeeper during a delivery of linens, who repeated them, embellished considerably, directly to Eleanor herself. By the time Alaric arrived at the small cottage that evening, hoping to explain the truth in his own words before anyone else could distort it, he found Eleanor already waiting for him in the parlor, her expression cold in a way he had never seen from her before, not even during their first frosty dinner together. "I understand," she said, before he could speak a single word, "that I have been something of a charity project. Eleanor, that is not a debt," she continued, as though he had not spoken at all, "owed to my mother, paid through her daughter, because your aunt could not bring herself to make amends while my mother still lived. I was seated beside you at every dinner, not because anyone believed I belonged there, but because your aunt needed a way to ease her conscience, and I happened to be convenient." "That is not the whole truth," Alaric said, moving closer, though she stepped back, putting the width of a small table between them. "Then tell me the whole truth, Your Grace. I am listening." He told her everything, as plainly as he could, the broken promise between her mother and his aunt, the guilt Lady Constance had carried for 20 years, the clumsy, misguided hope that had driven her to arrange their seating without either of their consent. He watched Eleanor's face carefully as he spoke, hoping to see some softening, some understanding, but her expression remained guarded, closed off, in a way that frightened him more than any battlefield ever had. "So it is true," she said, once he finished. "I was a pawn in an old woman's penance. And you knew, at least in part, and said nothing to me. I did not know the full truth myself until this very afternoon. I came here the moment I learned it, to tell you before anyone else could." "How generous of you," Eleanor said, though there was no warmth in it. "Tell me, Your Grace, in all the weeks we have spent together, in every conversation, every walk in the garden, every moment, I foolishly believed you were choosing my company because you wanted it, and not because your aunt had arranged the circumstances that made it convenient. Did you ever once consider that I deserved to know the truth from the very beginning?" "I did not know the truth myself, not fully, until today," he repeated, though he heard how weak the defense sounded, even as he offered it. "But you suspected. You told me yourself, weeks ago, that you believed your aunt was orchestrating something. You continued spending time with me regardless, knowing full well I had no idea what game was being played around me." Alaric had no answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. He had suspected, and he had said nothing definitive, choosing instead to let their friendship, their growing affection, develop in the shadow of a truth he had not yet fully understood himself. "I am sorry," he said finally. "I should have told you the moment I suspected anything, rather than waiting until certainty forced my hand. Sorry does not undo the humiliation of learning that my place in your life was arranged before I ever had a chance to choose it for myself." "Then let me ask you now," Alaric said, his voice steady, despite the ache building in his chest, "regardless of how it began, regardless of my aunt's guilt, or her scheming, or her broken promises, do you believe that anything between us has been false? Do you believe I have not meant every word I have said to you these past weeks?" Eleanor's composure wavered, just slightly, the anger in her eyes giving way, for a moment, to something rawer and more uncertain. "I do not know what I believe anymore," she admitted. "I do not know how to separate what was real from what was arranged, and I find I need time, away from your aunt's schemes and your apologies, to work that out for myself." "Then I will give you that time," Alaric said, though every instinct in him rebelled against the thought of walking away. "But I will not stop hoping, Eleanor, that when you have had time to think it through, you will find that what grew between us was ours, entirely, regardless of the seating card that first placed us beside each other." She did not answer him, and after a long, painful silence, he took his leave, walking back to Rookwood Hall through the cold evening air, with a weight in his chest heavier than anything he had carried home from the war. Eleanor, for her part, declined every invitation that arrived from the great house over the following days. She refused 3 separate dinners, each excuse polite but firm, and when her Aunt Margaret pressed her for the reason, she offered only that she required time to think, without elaborating further on what exactly required such careful consideration. She spent those days walking the same familiar paths near her cottage, turning the whole strange affair over in her mind, again and again. She thought of Lady Constance's guilt, decades old and never properly resolved, and found she could not entirely fault the older woman for wanting to make amends, however clumsily she had gone about it. She thought of her own mother, dead now 2 winters, and wondered what Sophia would have made of her daughter being courted, in a roundabout and complicated way, by the nephew of the very woman who had broken her heart so many years ago. And she thought of Alaric, of his quiet honesty in the garden, of the way he had defended her from Lord Halden without hesitation, of the careful, unguarded way he had spoken of his own loneliness, a rare vulnerability from a man who had spent his whole life being watched and measured by everyone around him. She could not deny, however angry she remained at the manner of it, that something real had grown between them these past weeks. The question that kept her awake at night was not whether her feelings were genuine, but whether she could ever fully separate them from the scheme that had first brought them together, and whether that distinction mattered as much as her pride insisted it did. Alaric spent the following week in a state of restless misery that even Harold Pratt, normally the most discreet of men, felt compelled to comment upon. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said one morning, finding the Duke staring blankly at a ledger he had not turned a single page of in nearly an hour. "But you have not been yourself since your visit to Miss Whitmore's cottage." "I have made a mess of things, Harold. With respect, Your Grace, I believe your aunt made the mess. You have simply been standing in the wreckage of it." Alaric managed a weak, humorless smile. "That is perhaps too generous an assessment of my own part in this." He thought long and hard, over those difficult days, about what Eleanor had said to him, about the humiliation of discovering her place beside him had never been entirely her own choice. He understood her anger now, in a way he had not fully grasped in the moment, understood how it must have felt to learn that even her own presence at his table had been decided by someone else's guilt, rather than her own worth being recognized honestly. He resolved, finally, that if he wanted any chance of repairing what had been broken, he could not simply apologize and wait for her forgiveness to arrive on its own. He needed to prove, through his own actions, entirely separate from his aunt's schemes, that his regard for her had never depended on any seating card, any old debt, any careful arrangement designed by someone else. He began, quietly and without fanfare, to reshape the household in ways that had nothing to do with impressing his aunt's guests or satisfying tradition. He spoke with Harold about reducing the frequency of the large formal dinners that had governed the household since his father's time. Dinners designed more for display and matchmaking than for genuine connection. He spoke with his aunt, carefully and without accusation this time, about the importance of honesty going forward, insisting that whatever guilt she carried about Sophia Whitmore, it was not something she could resolve through further scheming, however well-intentioned. Lady Constance, to her credit, accepted the rebuke with more grace than Alaric expected. "I have spent so many years trying to fix what I broke through careful arrangement," she admitted, "that I forgot entirely how to simply be honest and let events unfold as they will. It is a difficult habit to break, Alaric, after so long." "Then perhaps it is time you tried," he said, and she did not argue. He wrote to Eleanor twice during that week, careful letters that made no demands and offered no further apologies, only honest accounts of his days, small observations about the estate, questions about a book she had once mentioned enjoying. He did not ask her to forgive him, and he did not ask her to return to his dinners. He simply wrote to her, as one person writes to another they hope might still, eventually, wish to know them. She did not reply to either letter, and he told himself, with more patience than he felt, that this was simply part of the time she had asked for, and that pushing harder would only prove her worst fears correct, that he was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of what anyone else needed. It was Margaret Cole, of all people, who finally broke the stalemate. She arrived at Rookwood Hall, unannounced one gray morning, refusing tea, refusing pleasantries, coming straight to the point, with the same bluntness her niece so often displayed. "My niece is miserable," she said, standing in the entrance hall with her hands folded tightly before her. "She will not admit it, but I have raised her since her mother died, and I know misery when I see it, wearing her face every morning. Whatever quarrel exists between you, Your Grace, I would ask that you resolve it, one way or another, because watching her pretend she does not care is far more difficult than watching her actually be angry. She has not replied. Writing is easy, Your Grace, and easily ignored. If you truly wish to prove your regard was never about your aunt's guilt, you will have to do more than send careful letters and wait patiently for forgiveness to arrive at your convenience. It was, Alaric realized, exactly the push he had needed and had been too cautious to give himself. He thanked Margaret Cole for her honesty, and within the hour, he was riding toward the small cottage he had visited so many times these past weeks, though never before with quite this much resolve settled in his chest. He found Eleanor in the garden behind her cottage, kneeling in the dirt among the last of the season's flowers, her sleeves rolled up and her hands stained with soil in a way no proper lady would allow herself to be seen by anyone she wished to impress. She looked up at the sound of his approach, startled, then guarded, then something softer she could not quite hide fast enough, before he noticed it. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing the dirt from her skirts, with as much dignity as she could manage. "I was not expecting visitors." "I did not come as a visitor," Alaric said. "I came because your aunt told me you were miserable, and because I could not bear the thought of leaving things between us the way they stood after our last conversation. My aunt had no right to speak of my feelings without my permission." "No," Alaric agreed, "she did not, but I am grateful she did, because it gave me the courage to say what I should have said the moment I first suspected the truth about my aunt's arrangements, rather than waiting for certainty to force my hand." Eleanor said nothing, watching him carefully, her arms crossed against the cool autumn air, though whether the gesture was meant to protect against the cold or against him, Alaric could not tell. "I cannot undo how we met," he continued. "I cannot pretend the seating card that first placed you beside me was anything other than my aunt's guilt dressed up as hospitality. But I can tell you, honestly, that everything I have felt since that first dinner, every conversation, every walk in the garden, every moment I found myself thinking of you when I should have been thinking of estate business, or war reports, or anything else entirely, none of that was arranged by anyone but my own heart, which apparently made up its mind about you long before I was brave enough to admit it. That is a very fine speech, Your Grace. It is not a speech. It is the truth, spoken as plainly as I know how to speak it, because you deserve plain truth far more than you deserve fine speeches." Eleanor's arms slowly uncrossed, her guarded expression softening by degrees, though she did not yet close the distance between them. "I have spent this past week trying to decide whether my own feelings were real, or whether I had simply convinced myself of something, because your aunt arranged the circumstances so carefully that I had little choice but to fall into them." "And what have you decided?" "I have decided," she said slowly, "that feelings arranged by circumstance can still be genuine, provided the people feeling them are honest enough to examine them properly, rather than accepting them blindly. I have thought of little else these past days but you, Your Grace, and I do not believe that is something your aunt's scheming can take credit for. I believe that is simply the truth of my own heart, however inconvenient the timing of its discovery." Alaric closed the remaining distance between them, close enough now to see the faint traces of dirt still on her cheek, where she had brushed a stray hair aside without realizing it, close enough to reach for her hand without either of them pulling away. "Then let us begin again," he said, "properly this time, with no schemes and no seating cards, simply two people who have decided, honestly and of their own free will, that they wish to know each other better." "I would like that," Eleanor said, and this time, when she smiled, there was no guardedness left in it at all. Word of their reconciliation reached Lady Constance before the day was finished, carried by a servant who had spotted the Duke's carriage returning far later than expected, and with rather more cheerfulness in his manner than he had shown in over a week. She received the news with quiet relief, though she said little of it aloud, choosing instead to busy herself with preparations for what she called, simply, a small dinner among friends, to be held the following fortnight. When the evening finally arrived, the household staff found themselves faced with an unusual instruction. The seating cards, this time, were not to be arranged by the housekeeper, nor reviewed and adjusted by Lady Constance herself. The Duke of Rookwood, they were informed, would be arranging the seating personally. Guests arrived that evening, expecting the usual careful precision of Lady Constance's dinners, the polished arrangements of rank and precedent that had governed every gathering at Rookwood Hall for as long as anyone could remember. What they found instead was a table arranged with far less concern for tradition and far more concern for genuine comfort. Old friends, seated together, quiet conversationalists placed near those who might draw them out, and at the head of the table, beside the Duke of Rookwood himself, sat Eleanor Whitmore, dressed simply as always, though there was nothing uncertain in the way she took her seat this time. Charlotte Halden, seated several places down and clearly disappointed by the arrangement, could not quite hide her surprise. Lord Halden, who had not been invited at all following his behavior in the garden weeks earlier, was notably absent, a fact that seemed to trouble no one in attendance. Lady Constance took her own seat at the far end of the table, watching the two of them with an expression that mixed quiet satisfaction with something gentler, something that looked almost like the peace of an old debt finally, properly repaid, not through careful manipulation, but through honesty, allowed, at last, to run its own course. "You seem pleased with yourself," Alaric murmured to Eleanor as the first course was served, the candlelight catching the warmth in her eyes as she glanced toward him. "I am pleased," she admitted, "though I will confess, Your Grace, that I never expected to end up exactly where your aunt intended, seated beside you at a Rookwood dinner, of all places." "The difference," Alaric said, reaching for her hand beneath the edge of the table, where only the two of them could feel the quiet certainty of it, "is that this time, it was not an incorrect seat at all. It was simply where I chose to place you, because there was nowhere else in this house, or in my life, that I would rather have you be." Eleanor's fingers curled gently around his, and for the first time since that very first dinner so many weeks ago, there was no confusion left between them at all, only the quiet, settled understanding of two people who had found their way to each other, however roundabout the path, and who had no intention now of letting go. Lady Constance, watching from the far end of the table, allowed herself, at last, a small and private smile, the kind of smile reserved for old promises finally, properly kept.